So welcome again. I'm honored this afternoon to introduce Aric Lasher to our 2018 Bullfinch Keynote. To me, Aric is our own Howard Roark, doing things different, pushing the envelope, breaking all boundaries, ignoring the norm, reaching for the modern change. Some of us may rebel at having such a man so described to give our Bullfinch keynote today, but how is he doing this? By using the classical and traditional language as a datum to connect our past culture with our present culture, and our present culture with our future's culture. It seems like a crazy off-the-wall concept, but I would argue that the popularity of a single project of his, the Tuscaloosa Federal Building and Courthouse, has done more to disrupt the modern movement of architecture and validate the use of the classical language today than anything in the last 50 years. Classicism as the next disruptive innovation. It may seem paradoxical, but it's happening, and we are witness to it. Aric is the president and director of design at HBRA Architects in Chicago, where his projects have included buildings for government, cultural, academic, and public institution residential projects, landscapes, renovations, restorations of historic structures. Recent work includes Yale University's Bass Library, renovations at the Beinecke Rare Books and Manuscripts Library, the University of Notre Dame's new Jenkins and Nanovic Halls, the renovation of Northwestern University's iconic Daring Library. His interest in the evolution and planning of building assemblies is explored in his book Plans of Chicago, which considers the legacy of planning innovation and the future of the city from an analytical and urban historical perspective. Mr. Lasher graduated from College of Architecture, Art and Planning at Cornell in 1984, has a master's in fine arts and film production from the USC School of Cinema Arts. In addition to his work in architecture, he has designed sets for numerous films, including The Minority Report, Pearl Harbor, What Dreams May Come. Aric's professional affiliations include the Society of Midland Authors, the Art Directors Guild, the Society for College and University Planning, the Mies van der Rohe Society, and the Society of Architectural Historians, where he currently serves on the board of directors. Mr. Lasher is also a fellow of the American Institute of Architects. Again, we welcome Aric Lasher.
Thank you. Sounds so distinguished on paper. Thank you for having me here. I think it is an extraordinary opportunity to be in the company of distinguished peers. I think that as people that work with the classical language and other received languages of architecture, we are at an interesting time, maybe one of existential challenges. So in putting this talk together, rather than speaking extemporaneously about my own work, although I do have some of that in here, I decided to structure it as an essay. It is a rambling disquisition, but I hope you'll be patient and that maybe some questions will arise out of it at the end. Since it's not an academic audience, and many of us are engaged in somewhat related broad pursuits, I'm guessing, I've decided to present a rumination on subjects and justifications that I personally struggle with daily. As I suspect that many of you do as well, I thought I might share these questions and conclusions and thereby either help to clarify or cultivate resistance to them. There exists today a profound separation between architects who refer to the vast cultural legacy of established architectural form and expression, modern and not modern, in a serious, disciplined, and critical way, and those who embrace the idea of a self-correcting, contemporary, technological, expressionistic approach that looks toward the future and rejects other recognizable approaches. See if this works. Magic. One is representational and deploys the power and expressiveness of recognized architectural languages that bring their own associations, intended and not, to works that serve the purposes of embodying or promoting the identities of individuals or institutions. The other is aspirational and confident in its disengagement from work that emerges from or speaks to a temporal and historic context that some believe cannot be truly relevant to our unprecedented circumstance. This approach can also powerfully serve to forge or convey identity. Both are capable of producing notable, successful works that inspire and might perhaps endure as meaningful expressions of the architect's art. In his book, The Architecture of Happiness, Alain de Botton restates Stendhal's assertion that beauty is the promise of happiness. As the vessel for our real or idealized lives and activities, should it not follow that architecture is the promise of happiness? It seems very simple, but offer a contrary version of such beauty or happiness in the halls of the Academy and witness the eruption of outrage, disbelief, or what I think is worst of all, pity. I imagine that some here have been on the receiving end of a dismissiveness that in younger or less assured students or architects can have a silencing effect. It goes something like, poor thing, living in a sad and irrelevant reverie, doesn't even know enough to be embarrassed. This kind of shaming closes the door to serious discussion or defense when a preemptive neutralization stops things before they can begin. It's a sadly effective strategy, and it also resists scrutiny for some reason. For some, the happiness of architecture is found in the potent forms evolved over time. For others, the unfettered and unprecedented shapular, that's my own word, shapular forays, signal a better future unburdened by the sins of the father. I am mystified, personally, that those who love their art and seek a deep understanding of their medium can possibly have that interest cease in the case of work produced before the 1920s. And to profess immunity to the power of excellent contemporary work seems to me to deny the affective power of architecture and its regenerative potential. I suspect that these exaggerated revulsions and allegiances that inspire particular zealotries in architects are like other learned prejudices. Nobody is born with these. Prejudiced individuals are made. And I make a distinction between prejudice and predilection. What kind of inculcation occurs in the academy to alienate architects from the fullness and satisfaction that centuries of architectural production provide? Of our time usually means modernism of any and all types. Mid-century modern is of our time, while non-modern 20th century decorative styles are somehow not of our time. It's a curious argument. There's a strain of critical thinking that asserts that architecture is ideally generated without explicitly deploying the forms or idioms of other historic periods, and is therefore somehow genuine and honest, which I find to be odd moralizing terms to be ascribed to a building. This sidesteps the fact that much architecture considered historic or canonical represents already a transformation of earlier expressions for effect, meaning, or to conform to new needs and ways of building. Or that modernism or modernisms might be regarded as canonical, their forms being referenced in contemporary work as would other precedents, or at least in good contemporary work. I was fortunate not to have been discouraged in my interests, either as a young person in love with buildings or as a student or in the early years of my apprenticeship. I've pursued many approaches with joy and vigor, and I'm grateful to have not had to censor my own inspiration. I grew up with Cray, Wright, Mies, and Saarinen, and I was never compelled to proclaim allegiance to one or the other. There was also nobody to compel me to do so. I grew up in Detroit in sort of a vacuum of sorts. Really, though, we need to move beyond, I think we need to move beyond our personal loves and aversions in a very clear-headed way if we're going to address the place for representation in a sober and constructive way when having to defend methods and forms that increasingly run contrary to prevailing notions of contemporary propriety. The choice of expression is crucial. It cannot be dismissed simply as an exercise in fashion or style, or a secondary process of embellishment or application. This choice is rooted in circumstance as much as personal predisposition. It's not a choice to be taken lightly, as it has considerable consequence both for the work but also for the environment, physical, and I think most significantly cultural, in which it will reside. So consider this. I am quoting from Simon Leigh's collection of essays, The Hall of Uselessness. I recommend it. The fact is, these two arts, history writing and fiction writing, originating both in poetry, involve similar activities and mobilize the same faculties, which are memory and imagination. And this is why it could rightly be said that the novelist is the historian of the present and the historian the novelist of the past. Both must invent the truth. If applied to architectural creation, a modernist might perhaps be the historian of the present, or of an aspirational future of sorts, and the traditionalist the novelist of the past, or an aspirational future of sorts. Both must invent the truth. The disruption and chaos emerging from the artistic, technological, and social ruptures of the 20th century continue to be magnified by changes in patterns of growth, use, scale, and communication. The subsuming of physical experience by the ceaseless flow of images and information through devices only serves to disengage more and more of us from the actual experience that used to put architecture and urban space at the center of a concentrating and affected shared phenomenon. The very ideas of thoughtful composition, evolution of cities and towns, and nuance in architecture face an existential threat from ever more compelling distractions. This might further diminish any advocacy for meaningful and enduring work if architecture is to comprise little more than a secondary backdrop for virtual experiences. Admittedly, I did spend some time during my career advocating for a deep and affecting architecture by putting it on the screen. I felt that somehow somebody might pay attention to it if they saw it on a screen or on a TV, since they didn't seem to pay as much attention to it in reality. Cultivating love for architecture through its simulation. As it were, both I and some of my colleagues did find our way back to building in the physical world. I put this pair of images up here because I think it is telling. The image on the left is a postcard illustration of Chicago's Merchandise Mart, which shows its original nighttime lighting scheme, which was conceived to accentuate its architectural characteristics and its architectural idea. The image on the right shows a proposal which might actually come to pass of using the river face of the Merchandise Mart as a permanent rotating site for art projection. What that does is it obliterates the architecture entirely. And I'm just afraid that in our need for more and more stimulation and a growing obsession with media, it doesn't necessarily bode well for architecture. Motivations for totalizing approaches, which are exclusive and jealous, are diverse. One might be the reassuring allure of the image of continuity in an age, our age of ephemera and chaos. The dream of totality has, when it's been realized, been so riveting that it can inspire an absolutist fervor. From the Ville Radieuse to any number of idealized cities, the possibility of a terminal correction frozen in time at history's end doesn't provide a lot of opportunity or direction for those of us looking to participate in most realistic, achievable, constructive enterprises. Some of the most striking versions of idealized worlds can be found in historic illustration or the breathtaking projections of futurism. They are kitsch, but they are alluring, and I think they are most telling of our deeper longings. The enduring impact on those who visit cities such as Paris ensure that a cohesive overall approach to organization, scale, material, and expression remain potent and persuasive because they are in fact there, as unlikely as they are to be achieved in our new circumstances. These images, historic or futurist, are nostalgic, soaked with the ineffable sorrow of a past that never was and a future that never happened. All demonstrate evidence of the power of nostalgia in the popular consciousness. Notable exceptions to these totalizing envisions include the impure and ad hoc interventions of the metabolists in such collectives as Archogram, in which buildings shed their buildingness entirely. These ephemeral exercises in disposable industrial design intervene in rather than engage their pre-existing surroundings. They oppose. Traditional buildings in unsympathetic environments, whether lone survivors or later additions, could suffer from a similar isolation. It might seem that this condition, more often than not, represents the challenge of introducing a new building of any type, or a new building of quality and presence of any type, into an unwelcoming and heterogeneous context, a familiar and almost ubiquitous condition of modernity. There is a place, however, for the perfect object, the irresistible paradigm that forces our attention and stands apart from the environmental noise that usually engulfs and overwhelms us. A resolute and successfully realized work of recognizable form can provide a moment of clarity amidst the cacophony of the gray mass of the contemporary metropolis, or might at least establish some sense of place where none presently exists. The pursuit of a watertight notion of truth can be, I think, corrupting in its insistence on purity. And I'm going to quote St. Augustine now. People have such a love for truth that when they happen to love something else, they want it to be the truth. And because they do not wish to be proven wrong, they refuse to be shown their mistake. And so they end up hating the truth for the sake of the object which they've come to love instead of the truth. As an aside, I was recently instructed by a visitor to a public session in which thoughts were being solicited for a yet-to-be-designed building in a notable historic context, that it must be modern and therefore not deceitful. It was almost a threat. And what I ask is modern today. And doesn't most good architecture strive to deceive in some way? I'm neither making a singular case for precedence or pure innovation, but rather to define a position of choice within an environment that by necessity must embrace countervailing arguments. A fierce and tiresome battle is waged along familiar lines. I'm sure we all know it. The fact that we practice at a time in which multiple approaches are possible and all capable, in the right circumstances, of producing results of great sophistication, and that we live at a time which, in many cases, legitimate arguments can be made for a variety of strategies, suggests that our present-day built environment would comprise a varied representation of work and modes of practice. That work which engages either a broad arc of history and of architectural production or a narrow one should have its own exclusive advocacy, publications, and prizes, exacerbates a deep rift. And I say this with the understanding that the reason that traditional architecture has constructed it, that is because we were basically ridden out of the public eye by another orthodoxy. But this insularity and these camps tend to marginalize or delegitimize contrary or alternative approaches. I would offer that these are both remarkable achievements here, and that either expressive approach would appear potentially ridiculous or destructive in the other's context. I envy those architects who are never challenged by doubt, who see beauty only in the orders or see meaningful form only in new and wholly unencumbered ways. But I am confident in my belief that we potentially live in a golden age of sorts, and that a surrender to a love for architecture, not uncritical, but open and liberated from indoctrination and bias, can lead to inexpressible joy. Early modernists had to poison the well to make way for these new expressions, and their arguments are surprisingly persistent, even if they're dubious in their defensibility today. The first image, the image on the left, is from a Yale newspaper, an opinion piece lamenting the lost opportunity for modernism in the design of James Gamble Rogers' magnificent Sterling Memorial Library. Corbusier dismissed as historical souvenirs buildings whose genesis was rooted in persistent and constant overarching principles and perceptions. He sought a complete reinvention. Colin Rowe subverted Corb's claims to absolute originality despite his fervent admiration for Corb's work. By demonstrating comparative similarities between Corbusier's villas and those of Palladio, suggesting that the path had valuable lessons, but whose application was permissible only if properly distanced from precedents through abstraction or transformation. Personally, I couldn't help but reach the nagging conclusion that as effective a pedagogic tool as some of Collins' methods were, and I benefited from them, I think, as a student, Palladio is not at all, in fact, Corbusier. So this is where we who use moldings on occasion and seem to find ourselves. We're at odds with the whole idea of the architect as hero-creator, which is a role that is settled in the public imagination to the extent that building with familiar forms is seen to betray a lack of imagination, a reactionary, anti-progressive stance, or plagiaristic methods. So this is a box of moldings, which I had designed, some interesting, some ordinary, for a single residential project. Moldings forbidden. Rather than leading from behind, though, I think it's essential to offer a rational case for exceptions, one that emerges from a clear understanding of the more specialized role for traditional expression in the contemporary world. Okay. Well, we must make choices and we must find opportunities or realize work that's in alignment with our personal choices and convictions. How do we confidently pursue work that embraces precedented expression without zealotry or dismissal of the importance of other paths? I think that clear, intellectually defensible choices are possible, and that clarity of purpose and objective are essential if we are going to inspire endorsement and confidence in the application of evolved expressions from our patrons and from the public whom our buildings will serve and represent. Here are some variously public buildings that I've drawn in the past. The power of language is arbitrary. Languages are arbitrary, but it is deep, beautiful, and nuanced. Language's origins are mysterious, but to the fluent, they seem as natural as birdsong. All languages have distinct capacities and limitation to give form to conceptual structures and worldviews. Because languages are specific, much is lost in their translation. But some things transcend and endure. Perhaps classicism is the clearest example, rooted in such basic principles and demonstrating such broadly admired characteristics that it can be found in many expressions and vernaculars worldwide. Regardless of the scope and applicability in our modern circumstance, traditional forms, with the embodied depth and association that their long evolution has invested them with, often powerfully convey a singular pull and resonance, both to the erudite and to the naive. Consider for a moment the origins of antipathy to precedented form. I think that this is important because it presents a growing obstacle to finding and realizing important public and commercial commissions that adopt the inspiring but freighted path of precedence. So one of these is that of unintended messages. So the association, whether true or false, with authoritarian regimes, human subjugation, privilege, and an exclusive antiquarianism and promotion of a single cultural narrative are often cited in arguments against, in particular, classicism in the public realm. Revolt against static institutions such as church or state often included the rejection of the building forms broadly associated with them. So progress was seen as being something that could be manifested in new forms for new purposes. Elitism is also raised as an argument against form, as was the case with, for example, the French Revolution or the Chinese Cultural Revolution. So here, Fragonard's devil-may-care couple heedlessly frolic, unawares of the fate that awaits them, which is Marie Antoinette's fate on the right, the drawing by David of her en route to the guillotine, which is due punishment for heedless extravagances and immoral decadence and moldings. So this is how we are seen by some people, to the strains of the harpsichord or the hammer dulcimer. So the image on the left is an idealized diagram of a garden city. To the right is Corbusier's Plan Voisin for central Paris, familiar. Exaggerated expectations and notions propagated through criticism and manifestos usually disappoint. They drag their associated expressions down with them. Expectations based on the moralizing and socially transformational capacities of architecture and urbanism are rarely met. Interestingly, modernism's social agendas have long been discredited, but their forms remain, described using terms such as clean or open, which again are strange, subtly moralizing terms. Early and well-intentioned reformers sold architecture through exploiting the fallacy that moral buildings produced moral societies. Personally, I think, if anything, it would be the other way around, but I don't know what a moral building is. And then there's morphological slippage. Poorly applied or badly realized versions of architecture whose language is broadly understood allow qualitative deviations to be readily apparent, which is a consequence of the shared familiarity of a more or less correct model. Most people, through familiarity, know what things are supposed to look like. They know when they're off. But I have to say, without sarcasm, the persistence of these forms is also testament to the power of the language in which they originate. Then there's the argument that traditional languages, whose elements in many cases evolve from materials and construction, are an unnatural fit for contemporary means and methods of building. Christine. The archaeological perspective and the rise of new technologies and the emergence of the public building as an ascendant building type of increasing importance saw the architecture of the 19th century take on a trajectory that profoundly changed the appearance of buildings. Was modernism inevitable? From Le Proust to D.H. Burnham, architects wrestled with the relationship of new technologies, cultural change, and recognizable constant form. Critics later somehow lumped all of this under the generalized label of historicism and characterized it as a collection of irrelevant forms styled for dead eyes. But Henri Le Proust challenged the notions of historical propriety of his time, pursuing a use of form that took a deliberate and iconoclastic approach to historic quotation. He was also not timid in his use of new materials and methods. Time for a sip of water. Ice cube. Did architects exhaust the expressive power of these languages through careless application? That is a question I have. Excuse me. By the end of the first quarter of the 20th century, in the West at least, historic veneers of considerable sophistication were being applied to buildings of all description, from bungalows to commercial high-rises, along with the public and institutional buildings which had been the typical candidates for the alliances of culture that historicism conveyed. One has to wonder if giving banks and commercial buildings the aspects of courthouses and churches led to an exhaustion or cultivated a suspicion of any higher purposes for representational architecture through its dilution. Here are two refined examples of high modernism, beautiful with a precision and an explicit, rarefied approach to taxis. They were both done by Mies van der Rohe. One is a commercial building, the other one on the right houses, among other things, a federal courthouse. Their appearance makes no distinction of their purpose or cultural association. Both look like commercial structures, however elegant. In the early years, some notable modernists, I think it might be Mies, suggested that a sabbatical from ornament, or it might have been Loos, I don't know, sabbatical from ornament would eventually allow architects to more deliberately consider how to clothe their structures. I might agree with that if it ever occurred, but I'm still waiting for it to happen. The unleashing of new potential in form and space making was and continues to be capable of breathtaking impact and some ability for regeneration. But the power of received idioms remains as well, or at least among some and in some places. My question is, does it have to be a zero-sum game, and must the world choose one or the other? Does the world care? And why can't traditional forms be deployed to accommodate new ambitions? So composer John Adams, he is a somewhat eclectic but largely considered minimalist composer, still alive, once claimed that originality wasn't an urgent concern for him in the way it was necessary for the minimalists, and compared his position to that of Gustav Mahler, J.S. Bach, and Johannes Brahms, who were standing at the end of an era and were embracing all of the evolutions that occurred over the previous 30 to 50 years. I think we might just be at the end of not just one, but manifold eras. the point in the birth, development, rejection, and revival of modernism. And by modernism, I include 19th century eclecticism and neoclassicism. This perspective is vexing in its range of choice and the self-consciousness it produces, but it does allow for multiple paths. We can't unlearn, but our relatively expansive perspective, both backward and forward, could unshackle us from these distinctions that so often result in discordant and poorly resolved adjacencies and juxtapositions. Moralizing and defensive arguments used by advocates as well as opponents of formal devotions, culture versus venal commerce, the elitist dimensions of nostalgia, are widespread and usually falter under critical scrutiny. And my favorite is the false equivalence. So one is, all is equal. Traditional architecture, in fact, satisfies the modernist program. Or modernism transcends subjectivity while possessing all the essential characteristics of architecture without the irrelevance of forms conjured by dead architects. And then sustainability, traditional buildings endure and perform, or others would say traditional buildings are wasteful of resources, inadequate in their ability to satisfy unprecedented technological needs. And then there's neuroscience and projection, or perception, that people prefer traditional forms and proportions because science says so. I mean, there are a lot of arguments out there. It's also been offered that modernism can, through abstraction, proportion, massing, and material reference, we all know about this, convey the same presence and meaning previously delivered through other expressive approaches. All of these might be true in circumstances, but to me they seem to apologize for some lurking suspicion or unpopularity. These kinds of rationalizations don't seem confident. They emerge from a place of insecurity. So on the left you have the extraordinary Poundbury, which adopts in a full and robust manner traditional principles of planning, construction, and design for people who want it and people who can afford it. In the center, you have Corbusier's Pessac housing, which imposed a utopian modernist vision on people who were probably not enthusiastic about it, didn't want it or ask for it. And on the right, one of these techno-paradises that is sprouting up in Korea. One needs a sober evaluation of the place of expressive work in our present and heterogeneous context to confidently advocate the use of established languages when they're either desired or appropriate. The outcome of this kind of assessment, I find, usually falls somewhere along a spectrum of essential, subjective, or inappropriate. Essential when sensitive environments that have an established and valued role in expressing identity and embodied history are present. In our practice, these characteristics are most often and consistently found in collegiate campus buildings and ensembles. Subjective when neither approach would be deleterious to its context, which is, again, an opinion. In principle, and either could satisfy programmatic, economic, material, and representational requirements. It then becomes a matter of taste and preference. Some clients or constituencies may wish to be represented in some way. Take, for example, the courthouse. So we have done a courthouse in Alabama, which you already spilled the beans on that. Probably some of you know about it. It was considered very important to relate the building to both the broad associations of architecture and the federal government, as well as local classical traditions. And there was an aversion to modernism due to its associations with commercial structures. It was considered cheap and ordinary. In Los Angeles, for example, though, such a building might appear culturally and contextually aberrant. Hence, a completely different approach was taken in that case. We did not design that building. This is often the case with residential commissions whose appearance is usually preordained by the taste of a client and not beholden to a public interest. Inappropriate when scale, available construction methods, desires from the client and public, and context would render such approaches misplaced, unconvincing, incapable of surviving translation to given program scope or scale, or when the associations or identities that a chosen style projects would arouse negative reception. So how do we achieve reconciliation with contemporary ways of building, with current needs and opportunities? I mean, there are some environments or programs that demand junk space, accommodation of frequent change in some circumstances, open and casually defined spaces, which have become familiar and sought after by some people, and with our eyes wide open. So these are examples of work from our office. And we embrace what are often given methods of construction for large buildings. There is sometimes limited opportunities to pick and choose. We rarely have been able to build, for example, with load-bearing masonry. Rather than struggle against them, we enlist and regulate them to support an expression that includes recognizable forms and symbols. We strive for synthesis rather than disengagement of form and means. This transformation of traditional form through new means of realization to new ends is by no means unique to our time. I would argue that the Romans used classicism to new ends in entirely different ways than their models were intended. So these American campuses, there are many, these are some examples that are notable, are examples of controlled ensembles under singular stewardship whose character and appearance comprise the public image and embodied identities of their respective institutions. Cultural enterprises, or places or institutions that embody or wish to convey continuity or relationships over a broad historic arc, find utility in building forms that emerge over time and whose notability transcends individual authorship. Examples can include buildings that stand alone in their surroundings, or cities, campuses, and ensembles that evolve slowly and have distinct character or form. Their expressive languages might be arbitrary, but they are broadly recognized and often offer clear association. Departure from them can also be very destructive to the character of the places that they inhabit. So this weird personal slide. I almost took it out. I probably should have. But when I arrived in Chicago from Switzerland in 1985, I landed in the midst of an ideological crisis of sorts that was affecting most architects and academics. This crisis followed a widespread exhaustion and disillusion with modernist orthodoxy that produced a pervasive environment of inquiry, protest, and insecurity. Similar questions were being asked by architects working within a diversity of firms that ranged from global practices to smaller but influential offices. It was a very exciting moment in some ways, but many of the brittle exercises that it produced more often than not served to diminish the currency of traditional form and bolstered the assertion that old forms through new means was untenable. In the aftermath of these discipline-wide failures, we as a firm had to find a way past sophistry and abstraction. We've learned ways of approaching circumstance in no small part from working with existing, often spectacular buildings. They are great teachers. Buildings that are easily compromised or wrecked by insensitive work. These methods can also be applied to things that are conjured from nothing, lending them a sense of depth and resonance. And this is something that I did in designing for film. The trick is, of course, to avoid contrivance. And again, this was an essential way of thinking for film design, which sought to portray a believable, realistic world that had emerged usually from imperfect circumstances and the work of many unrelated authors. Colin Rowe's premise, which was one that I had learned with considerable skepticism, was one that heeded adjacencies, not skeptical about that. Not necessarily conforming to existing conditions, but responding to and meaningfully engaging them. Tom Beebe and I shared a Cornell education, not at the same time, but there was a certain regime of educators that was present in both of our experiences. It was generally open to historical quotation, as long as that was backed with disciplinary rigor. And advances in architectural preservation since then and restoration have provided a greater potential to realize form through traditional building methods and craft. Our work strives to express a client's distinct culture or identity through, rather than a proprietary formal language of our own. We've often superimposed a framework of classical order, as it allows the ordering of elements and spaces common to both mundane and contemporary uses and configurations, as well as timeless, exalted ones. It's effective in relating one to the other, particularly in cases in which both must be accommodating. So these represent what I consider to be two projects that occurred at a point of departure from the highly abstract, intellectualized, modernized postmodernism toward an architecture that embraced historicism and varying degrees of authentic detail, so that a building would be not about a building, but it would be its own building. On the left is the Rice Wing at the Art Institute of Chicago. That was the first building I worked on in the office. And I would say that its appearance and character are largely due to the request of the museum director at the time, who had just completed an extensive renovation of their historic Michigan Avenue building and wanted the experience to be continuous and not disruptive, which would be unimaginable now. And there are other reasons that it ended up as what it did, but I won't go into that, but they're very interesting and unexpected. But the project architect, Dennis Rupert, was working with historical detail in a way that was very synthetic. We were looking at Egyptian profiles, at archaic Greek elements and profiles, and these were combined and refined in a way to produce a language specific to that building, even though Paul Goldberger said it was the first building he'd seen in which the building appears to be holding up the columns, which I thought was very funny. Then there's the Harold Washington Library, which has influences as diverse as La Proust, John Wellborn Root's Rookery, and Ken Plumer and Ray Caskey sculptural ornaments, combined with that for a representational amalgam of various elements and motifs, harvested from Chicago's abundant and often contradictory architectural heritage. Personally, I like to think, no offense, but when the generation of those architects who are outraged by the design fades away, it will likely be seen for what it is. I often find the public likes the building, young people like the building, but the ideologues, horror. Okay. For our courthouse in Tuscaloosa, precedence was explored as a regional question, a representational study related to the building's use, the origins of democracy, and on the detail level through examples both direct and transformational. So these are studies that I had done early in the design process. They each represent regional familiar classicisms, Georgian revival, Greek revival, federal, and each of the schemes was married to a distinct party. The Greek revival scheme prevailed, not only for its representational resonance, but also for its easy pairing with modular planning, since a lot of the building are non-courts related agency spaces. But our use of precedents was also varied and sought a synthesis of classicism that was examined from many periods. So for the interior, we consulted the Aric fan. It's also the work of Carl Friedrich Schinkel. You see in the lower right-hand corner, that is a long-destroyed room in Berlin, the Prinzensaal. I scoured my sources of classicism to find a suitably attenuated Doric order. I was kind of terrified that, oh no, do we have an Ionic building that we want to be Doric? But the Nemean Doric, it turns out, was a manifestation of the Doric order, unusually stretched, that was admired by Schinkel and Peter Behrens, as the case would have it. And the lower image on the left is Peter Behrens' Has Wiegand. It was sort of a pre-abstracted version of Doric classicism. We took all of these and worked to reconcile their various characteristics as moving through the building. So these were some of the later exterior studies that I had done, some rough sketches over AutoCAD on the left, which are hideous but were useful. And again, the idea was to achieve a continuity through different forms applied to different circumstances that nonetheless would play well together. And the same was the case for the interior. Here are some of my studies of the interior. The idea of regulation was a very important aspect of this building, not only for these spaces, but for the dreary spaces that lie, not entirely dreary, but the conventional spaces that lie behind some of these walls. So this is some photographs of the completed building. We used modern methods of construction. In this case, it's a blast-resistant LEED Gold certified building that exists within a self-supporting masonry shell. Both strive for physical and aesthetic durability, which is essential for an institution with longevity. and some views of the interior. So the more enriched expression of public spaces was made possible and affordable through the use of cast multiples and modularity. And the courtrooms show the influence of the classicized modernism of Peter Behrens and Mies van der Rohe on the lower left. Both representational spaces and mundane office environments are regulated by the same modularity. I've already said that. And the artistic program speaks literally to the history of the region and the courts, with 16 narrative panels depicting significant events from prehistory to modernity, using local residents as models. Yale is a city, maybe more than a campus. It is heavily embroidered and deeply memorable. Yale-ness is described through an ineffable combination of related and unrelated elements that together produce a powerful sense of place. This two-story underground library, opened in 1970, which we replaced, failed as a consequence of its inability to convey Yale-ness. There was no advocacy whatsoever to take a modernist path for the new building, we found. And our building was built on a significant amount of the retained structural frame of the earlier library. These studies, which I drew at the very beginning of the design process, represent an evaluation of all what we consider to be all the defensible, expressive, and material approaches for the most representational element. That is the pavilion that signifies entry is also a book drop and an elevator that is apparent above ground. An explicit transposition of Rogers Collegiate Gothic is found on Sterling Memorial Library, which is Bass's neighbor and greater sibling, was the approach taken. That's the one at the top. But the one on the lower left takes the elements of the Noah Porter gates, which are right here, and transforms them into metallic and masonry architectural vocabulary. And this somewhat self-effacing minimalist modern approach attempts to go away, to be somehow other, and the Beinecke Rare Books and Manuscripts Library would be right behind you if you were looking at the pavilion there. Oops, wrong one. Departure and transformation were possible because most of the building was situated underground. Beginning from a diversity of precedents, a new language was devised that embraced the familiar and legible, symmetrical planning and organization of spaces, but also open planning, modern open space, and extensive use of glass that were still described through traditional materials and details. These are some of my drawings for development of, well, the interior and the exterior, actually. Symmetry, proportional reference to Sterling, and also the work of Samuel Yellen, the metal worker who has embellished many of Yale's buildings. The idea of the undercroft and the liberties that it afforded, and the inherent possibilities and limitations of the existing structure were all taken into account. A new vocabulary was evolved from the elements of the surrounding campus environment. It is an architectural departure that is nevertheless familiar. It's a difficult balance to achieve, sometimes more successful than others, depending on where you're looking. Above ground, the library's presence is gentle and idiosyncratic. It refers to its larger neighbor, Sterling, in the charming pavilion, and adopts the language and materials of what really isn't an ancient Gothic building. You know, it's like, should we be building Gothic buildings? Well, which Gothic buildings? Were they Gothic Revival buildings? Were they 13th century buildings? What does that mean? But a modern what Yale is a modern scenographic tour de force. It is not ashamed of it, and it is extremely successful, and it cultivates tremendous love and allegiance for the institution, and it is undeniable. The drawing on the right is the last design phase drawing I had done of the pavilion, and on the left, that was a Polaroid that the photographer took, but it didn't fully develop. And I thought it had a charmingly antique quality to suggest the building had been there forever, which, you know, new buildings, I know, are supposed to differentiate themselves from old buildings, but not there. And here's a selection of images from the building. It has, again, a modern sense of space. It uses materials and elements that might be germane to Gothic expression to respond to very specific circumstances of place, culture, and use. And I don't think it's unthinking in its application of dead forms. Oxford was still a city of aquatinth then. There's a beautiful Evelyn Waugh quote. It lent our laughter its resonance. I mean, it really speaks to the power of environment and the relationship of architecture to memory. I think Oxford, Cambridge, and other similar European institutions remain significant as models for the historic, timeless pursuit of academic excellence and critical inquiry. And therefore, they are not just aesthetically pleasing models for collegiate environments, but there is also a deeper meaning there. The University of Notre Dame was a late adopter of the collegiate Gothic style. Its early buildings were varied in their formal references. It is, however, especially relevant at Notre Dame, excuse me, as the scholastic traditions and the ecclesiastical ties of the university find eloquent expression through Gothic form. With few exceptions, however, the style is fairly dry, not always even. So there's some good 20s Gothic revival buildings there. There's a spectacular cram dining hall, very idiosyncratic. I don't have a picture of it here. And then there are some later ones that are, range from the to the. But in the last 20 years, they have reinstated very explicit stylistic guidelines in response to what were repeated failures of new, hybridized, and modern buildings to create any sense of inspiration or identity for the university. I think they realized that was a losing battle. Every iteration failed, and they are not shy about it. They have standards that are explicit. If you don't like them, work somewhere else. So these early sketches reflect the stipulated style and materials that new buildings must deploy. And these were fairly early. These were design phase sketches, but I would say they're very true to what we actually realized, which is reassuring. It's a pair of conjoined buildings, each with their own its singularity and dual identity, which is tricky but fascinating problem. In consulting, not only the local context, but other notable examples as well. We sought to realize a building that might revive and extend the success of the 20s buildings. Not just a comforting reverie, but a very meaningful expression of the institutional origins of the university and its goals and aspirations for its future. And these were also design phase sketches that I'd done of the interior. The interior is centered around a public gathering space that comprises the heart of a newly established School of Global Affairs. It was not to be overly lavish. The budget was for a conventional academic building. But I felt it needed to speak to a sense of shared identity in very specific architectural ways. What that usually means on campus for whatever, through whatever means is, drywall and maybe some wood panels, veneer panels applied. But, in this case, the effort was how do we take modest means, modest materials, and create something that is still resonant in the environment. These are some construction phase drawings of the building. So one of the stipulations was that we use cast stone, not natural stone. We embraced the idea of using multiples. And what's interesting here, the idea of truthfulness is that you can see that these pieces, some of which are large pieces, we were specific in our subdivision of the elements, in the proportion and scale of the individual pieces, even if they were components of a larger piece. The joints were grouted to match the joints of the surrounding masonry, not because this was sort of a fallacy or a deceitful building, but rather that the language of the collegiate Gothic is supported by certain expectations, a certain beauty and rightness that derives from the origins and the constructional methods that were used to build the predecessors to this building. We also found some extraordinarily ingenious precasters that were able to design releasable molds to provide sharp undercuts. And here are some photographs of the completed exterior. It is very Notre Dame in its flavor. It is not extravagant in the way that Yale buildings are, but it is what we hope to be the better example of what buildings moving forward in the collegiate Gothic style at Notre Dame can be. And again, as at Tuscaloosa, modern means were used to achieve a necessary economy, producing what I think is neither too utilitarian or overly embellished. That was a concern of the administration. There is a somewhat contemporary sense of space, but it uses familiar forms and motifs. So I did spend some time working in film. These are two very strange dystopian early sketches for a movie called Minority Report. Eventually, the time frame was brought closer to the present, and this sort of overheated phantasmagorical approach was discarded. But something that film teaches you to look for in just canvassing the built environment is how do things evolve imperfectly over time? What adjacencies work, what don't? Do you either want to play that up or not? And how do you do it in an uncontrived way? So to reverse engineer that has been a great education for me. So these are two drawings from a book that I co-authored with Samuel Roche, Plans of Chicago. It was a study of the history of planning in Chicago from the early Parks movement through the Burnham Plan, the Prairie Style, and the European modernists, who all had various experiments that were realized, unrealized, partially realized. And it was an interesting sort of exercise to look back on them and to see if there were conditions in the present-day city that could either benefit from them or demonstrated their imprint, and whether or not they could be re-enlisted as models to address contemporary needs or situations. But the conclusion of the book was kind of a design proposal. But what it was really an open-ended framework that allowed for distortions, discontinuities, organic growth. It simply looked at things as not as idealized, fully realized compositions, but rather incremental interventions that could correct or enhance some of the existing circumstances in the city. So our areas of focus were the most specific, the downtown lakefront, which bears the strong imprint of Burnham's plan. The intermediate fabric, which is generally subdivided into half-mile squares. That comprised the original urban periphery. It was accessible from streetcar and would have been considered a suburb in the streetcar days. And then the ex-urban periphery, which was actually the Prairie School architects looked at the intermediate fabric at about the time that the Burnham Plan was completed. And Ludwig Hilbersheimer looked at the ex-urban periphery, this marriage of sort of a diffuse environment of individual houses, institutional buildings, and open space. So this is an enlarged view of two of the quarter sections. What I was looking at here was how the city has grown sort of organically, that along the major thoroughfares you have mixed-use buildings or commercial buildings of a certain scale, that parts of the city have been rent by these later interventions, in this case the Kennedy Expressway. And there is also, where there aren't parks or public open space, there were proposals done by Jens Jensen and Frank Lloyd Wright that looked at the quarter sections and investigated ways to carve out shared green space within each one. So this serves to rectify the disruption of the expressway, to take all familiar housing types, whether they're freestanding houses, apartment buildings, mixed-use buildings, and combine or redistribute them in a way that achieves a more gracious assignment of public and private space. And this was an aerial view of the same pair of quarter sections. So I suggested maybe a method for working in our contemporary world, both figuratively and specifically, might involve looking right, looking left, looking forward, and looking back. So is a continuum a good general goal? Buildings that play well with one another, even if their organizing principles are different, their appearance or expression is different. Can we achieve some sort of agreeable continuity through difference? Mindfulness of transitions and moments of singularity is a potent exception, can produce an imperfect but cohesive environment. The alternative is what we largely have, which is a chaotic city of exceptions. One has to accept that both countervailing impulses will exist and exert pressure simultaneously in a contemporary circumstance. How to establish places for these contrary expressions in a way that avoids jarring opposition or chaos is the constant challenge that we face. But who makes those decisions? Often, usually it's not the architect. But the architect does have the bully pulpit and holds the pencil or mouse. So, architectural education might be a good place to start. Imagine a relatively unprejudiced view of architecture and its diversity, taught with a sense of love and admiration for the collective achievements of our discipline, and one also rooted in overarching principles that can in fact be taught and applied. Is it impossible? I had that. Maybe it was an aberration. I had that. Colorado, for example, offers parallel and complementary curricula that allow students to choose their own paths. And there are so many sources of inspiration to me. Perret, Lutyens, Berlage, France, Great Britain, and the Netherlands. Their work emerged from a synthesis of national tendencies and forms in architecture, as well as a reconciliation of established traditions in building and new technology in program. Tradition was not a dead end for them, and modernity didn't require a surrender of cultural specificity. So I'm going to quote here. I know I'm probably running over. But there was a potter in Japan. He's considered a living national treasure. His name's Kanashige Michiaki. And it's kind of a brilliant quote. Tradition is sometimes confused with transmission. Copying Momoyama pieces is transmission. Producing contemporary pieces incorporating Momoyama period techniques is tradition. Tradition consists of retaining transmitted forms and techniques in one's mind when producing a contemporary piece. Tradition is always changing. A mere copy of an old piece has not changed. It is nearly the same as its prototype of 400 years ago. Tradition consists of creating something new with what one has inherited. And I consider this to be an eloquent response to those who say, you're working with dead forms. You are not creative. How can you express our time through dead forms, through imitation? So tired of hearing that. Outside the dialectics of modernism and tradition, the rationalizations in the face of contrary evidence and a disturbing growing indifference amongst the public and the profession to traditional expression, ironically along with its persistent attraction and appeal. We must strive to find means to ensure that recognizable inherited form and expression evolve in our current circumstance. Those of us who use traditional forms might be flag bearers of a doomed army. I hope not. But maybe we can work diligently with satisfaction in a smaller but meaningful corner of our cultural landscape, leaving the heroic to those who strive for entry to, as Bob Stern put it recently in his interview in Architect magazine, modernist heaven. Is our public becoming inured to the effects of historically derived work? Does it eventually lose its potency? Are we at that point? The diminished presence of history in education, the deepening absorption, and I mean education of all types, the deepening absorption with personal media at the expense of affective experience, and the morphological slippage that continues to dilute and distort recognizable figures and forms might all be relegating culturally invested expression to a private realm, a realm of connoisseurship or one of erudition. Meaningful public commissions are essential, but the will must exist and their experience must leave more than an impression that this is just some oldsy-timesy thing or the voice of the few speaking to the many in a dead language. I like to think that we have achieved that on occasion. I think there are many architects that have achieved that on occasion and seem to do so with greater potency and verisimilitude. Important are the limits of such expression to survive the translation into modern building practices. The thinness and insubstantiality that lends some contemporary design its magical ability to escape the bonds of gravity can also effectively denature and lobotomize traditional buildings, despite the best application of compositional virtuosity. Unconvincing renditions in known languages can perhaps be far worse than poorly realized contemporary work, in part because their proper aspects are in fact intuitively familiar. Why is our sustenance of evolved expression important? not to reverse history, but rather for us to claim what I believe is an important and necessary place for the kind of representational presence that modernism does not satisfy and cannot fulfill, because it is often not specific in its association. Ang. Culture and art, in essence, are deceitful. Culture and art are arbitrary, and they are artificial. Architecture sings a song about weightlessness and flight, using dumb and heavy materials to suit mundane ends. Architecture is a lie that speaks the truth, or one of many. I don't think it needs to be censored, but the survival of evolved form depends on legitimate application and competent execution. And it must emerge from a place of understanding of its intended and unintended messages, where they might flourish, where they might languish, and how they might speak to new circumstances and give expression to new constituencies. If we teach the place of evolved expression in the context of a continuum that includes both past and present, one that embraces unspeakable riches capable of renewal and reinvention, just maybe we can rescue a rich and diverse history of building cultures from assignment to an oblivion of forgetfulness and irrelevance. Because once forgotten, culture is difficult to revive. And that is the conclusion.
Well, when we started these lectures, the original idea was to advocate through education, and I have to tell you, today I was just blown away by just an amazing experience. Thank you very, very, very much, both of you. That was just an amazing day.
Thank you for having me and listening to my strange disquisition.
Any questions? So where do we start? Don't be shy.
Are you going to publish this piece? It's such a wonderful disposition.
I hadn't thought of it.
Yeah, I think you should.
That is. You never know how it's going to go over. I thought maybe half of you would have left by now.
Well, talk a little bit about how it was received. How your work was received in Notre Dame. It looks like they were ready for you in terms of the set of guidelines.
Yes, and that set of guidelines has been around. John Berge is chair of the Buildings and Grounds Committee. So he and other trustees evaluate and compel the development of the campus. And I think he was largely responsible for instituting these newish guidelines. And they've had success, I think, in establishing an idea of consistency. They have regulated, the materials, the colors, the motifs in the models. But I think there was a long learning curve that both occurred within the profession, but also with the university. There are also conflicting pressures between the needs of facilities management and the higher, loftier goals of the university. So, for example, you're asked to design a 150-year building. You say, we can do great things with cast stone. I think it's a very interesting challenge, but natural stone will be easier to maintain over time, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, there are interesting contradictions there. But I think the feeling was that it's not so much that they weren't happy with the earlier attempts at a cohesive Notre Dame-style collegiate Gothic that had been achieved on campus, but they wanted to elevate its sense of authenticity, its affective power, and one of the first departures from the more kind of workman-like, utilitarian Notre Dame Gothic-y stuff was Ramsa's building for the business school. They had done a conference center on a fairly small site right across from ours. The two exist in, I think, harmonious dialogue with one another. But that was a departure, and that suggested, I think, a change or a greater ambition on the part of the Buildings and Grounds Committee. It was These commissions are very competitive. So you are usually on a short list with firms that you admire. I would also say for that reason, when you don't get them, you're not heartbroken because you think we are all in this together, and I look forward to what you produce. But we were very moved, very excited to be able to do a building which is really at the gateway to the campus. It's the first building now on Notre Dame Avenue that you encounter. So how it responds to its site, both symbolically, sculpturally, architecturally, is significant. Also, how can it provide presence for a newly established school? It was the first new school at the University of Notre Dame, founded in the last 100 years. And also, could it serve as, and I don't say this to be boastful or vainglorious, but could it serve as a model for buildings going forward? Could it raise the bar? We weren't taking cartoonesque versions of Notre Dame's collegiate Gothic, but we were looking at them seriously. We were also struggling to work with these new methods of construction to achieve something that had a sense of wholeness and appropriateness at all levels. I think that the university's path has become more ambitious. John Simpson is doing a new building for the School of Architecture, and it's coming along. I was just there 2 days ago, and it is, in a way, kind of a relief from the stipulated collegiate Gothic. There are some other buildings that are kind of weird and gargantuan that I'll leave it to you to decide whether or not they're successful. But the building was very enthusiastically received by the Buildings and Grounds Committee, both through the design process and at its completion. So that is very heartening and reassuring to us, and we have been invited back to do another building on Notre Dame Avenue, which we just kicked off Thursday. Christine.
Aric, thank you. It's a beautiful talk, as always. I love listening to you. And in fact, as you said beforehand, I think our talks were a nice complement to each other. What I want to ask you is kind of a very specific thing. I look at contemporary classical and traditional architecture, and I see a lot of success in the private residential realm at a range of price points from mid to custom. I see success in a good deal of new sacred architecture, particularly Catholic. And I see success in university projects. Where I don't see us gaining any ground at all is in any larger multifamily or high-rise or commercial projects. And I wondered if you could comment on that a little bit, on whether you agree with that kind of assessment, and why, if so, why you might think that's the case, and how we could change it.
I think another place that we have seen success is in middle income housing, either attached or detached. I think the work of the new urbanists is notable in its success. And that's the environment that is familiar to a lot of Americans. I live in a big city where modernism casts a long shadow, so there is, potentially a legitimate cause for endorsement of modernism in Chicago. But again, that modernism, I think, includes work that isn't modernistic. And few, if any, of the architects practicing there now probably think seriously about it or try to dismantle it in any way in their own work. I don't know. I know the struggles that we've had working, like, for example, for the federal government, that they, for a while at least, there was a pervasive interest in looking forward and trying to
Design excellence.
Right, release the shackles of the mundane and the unambitious. and look forward. But again, when you think of, and then, Eugene, Oregon might want a Tom Main building, but there are many places in the country that have very specific ideas as to what comprises an appropriate public building. And, you would think that an agency would give voice to all on a case-by-case basis, and tremendous struggles there. And the struggles are also economic, that sometimes, in many cases, to do a really convincing classical or traditional building can require additional expenditure up front. I mean, not if you're doing something, a gymnastic, Herzog and de Meuron spectacle of cantilevers, but, a box with a skin is certainly going to be less costly than a box with a beautifully realized skin and some sort of idea about its proportion and sculptural presence. I think that's part of it, but I think I don't buy that the public doesn't endorse it.
What about another category, another area, if I can follow up, David, is just it is also think about where are our, you showed the work from quite a while ago at the Art Institute in Chicago, but where are the great new classical commissions for the new museums on the Mall in Washington, D.C.?
Right.
For example.
Well, and for example, you can say if you have a museum of Native American history or a museum of African American art and history and culture, there are reasons that they may or should assume their own identity architecturally. You can also make an argument that you can use dead forms in the service of new ends, but sometimes those are freighted with associations. But there are many other examples that don't, conform to that wish or requirement, and there just seems to be no will for it.
Right. Okay.
And what's hard is when you do have an institutional sponsor, like university buildings, you usually have an institution that at some level takes seriously the long-term ambitions of the evolution of its campus rather than the flavor of the moment. And that is also tempered with other wishes, like maybe as you get further away from the center, you can take on a more experimental kind of architecture if that's desired. But even in those circumstances, the battles are just they're wearisome. When I feel like I'm going up in front of a firing squad, and we're not, what's a modern building? We aren't, giving you a little Lord Fauntleroy piece of embroidery here. We're giving you a serious piece of architecture that speaks to what's around it. I don't know. I think the commercial marketplace is funny. I think there is now a vernacular, especially for larger, taller buildings. They aren't expensive, specialized, or exalted enterprise like they used to be. They're now the cheap vernacular of a frame, components made off-site that snap together. They're kind of shiny. Try to figure out what kind of shiny is different than last week's kind of shiny to get the people who want shiny in them. And it's, that contest. And the way that buildings are often designed in detail, the whole production method, the use of parametric modeling, if you're lazy, lends itself to that. It's just a lot stacked against us. But it's interesting, probably the most desirable and expensive condominium building going up in Chicago is a Ramsey building.
Oh, that's good. The Ramsey focus.
We're all sitting here in this morning. We want to talk about this. So, Christine, we raised slot houses and Katrina cottages and dealt with the brokers and the market resale value of smaller residential, but we have found that, and thank you for mentioning, Aric, on Bannock Place, on Bannock Park, we have found a compelling, huge market for traditional multifamily residential. Our 15 Central Park West just crushed the market.
And it's totally unsatisfied. Like you look at it and you think, this is what people really want.
So I do think that the discussion that we had, and I'm very sorry, Aric, you missed it this morning. There was a discussion about the lasting, enduring market value of traditional architecture is applied to single-family residential or small multifamily residential. We've definitely found it in these large buildings, and the shiny, new, glassy thing simply doesn't sell as well. We sell at a higher price point. And 15 Central Park West is one, but 220 Central Park South, 70 Vestry, the Brompton, the Harrison, I can go on and on. Developers come to us specifically for that reason. How does one spread that word widely? That gets back to the discussion we had this morning.
Yeah.
But it's the same issue, and I think not a different one.
But it's not just in New York. In New York, it's very much at the top of the market. But also, it's now happening for us, at least in Chicago. We're working on a new project in Minneapolis. We're
Philadelphia.
Projects in California,
Charleston.
and in many places, all over China, where we found successful ways of mixing a ground level experience and a high-rise experience that gets the Chinese density maybe on their sites, but also gets a kind of walkable community. So I think there is a need and a desire for this everywhere.
Yes.
We found, we did some projects unrealized, ultimately, in China. And what was very interesting, we weren't building in, Shanghai, which is global cosmopolitan city. They were in Dalian, where you've done
We're working on
project. Yes. And there wasn't the kind of dictated a program to non-modern architecture there. It was taken for what it is and what it projects. And we were told flat out, buildings built during the Cultural Revolution, modern because they're cheap. Buildings built now in quantity are modern because that's the cheap way to build them. That is not what we want if we're given our choice. We want something special. And they considered modernism not special, which I found very interesting. There's been, I love modernism and find great modernism to be special. But there's less opportunity for specialness given the modernist palette than there is in other means of expression, I think.
I wanted to point out that 2 years ago, Justin Shubo did our first keynote lecture, and he spent about half of that talking about the problems with the federal courthouses and the modernism, and the link is on our website, New England ICAA, so just go there and you can find it. It's a pretty fascinating hour that he spent talking about it. Do you have any other questions?
I'm very, very sorry that I missed about half the lecture because I was mistaken as to when it was supposed to begin. But
The first half was the best half.
I'm going to be
It's on
touching base
film.
with you
It's on film.
about publishing, perhaps. If you don't have a place where you can get money from it, I can publish it in a place that at least will be it'll be read by some. So my question is, I wonder if you could discuss, if you haven't already, the relationship between, in today's contemporary traditional environment, the relationship between the canonical, the experimental / creative, and the inept. Is it always necessary to condemn the inept? Can't we try to uplift the inept through education?
I think the inept is salvageable through education. And I don't know if you saw my morphological slippage image, but my point with that was that degraded examples of recognizable styles are more readily apparent and can often sort of discredit that as an approach. But at the same time, they demonstrate the potency and the resiliency of those styles. And I'm convinced that if the architects, not always architects, but in the case in which architects design those buildings, if they were familiar with the methodology that leads to the successful relationship of parts to a whole and the ideas of proportion and composition, if that was something that they were taught, they don't even need to be taught that. If they were taught that there are resources that exist through which you can teach yourself how to do a building like that, if that is what your thing is. I mean, that's kind of what I've done. That there could be tremendous progress in terms of the appearance of the environment that surrounds us. Because those buildings are still there. Classicism in particular has a tenacity that's just unextinguishable. But there are very few. But I guess your question about canonical, adaptive, degraded, I probably think most of it exists somewhere in the middle. I think most, what is canonical? It's usually a point of departure, unless you're building a replica of something.
I regret that so often traditional architects on fora such as Trad-Arc list seem to demonize the inept. And there are various levels of the inept. I mean, we all know that ignorance is bliss, and so I bless myself that I don't know as much about architecture as just about everyone else in this room. Yet I write about it, and I think that if you consider bad trad to be a greater enemy to the classical revival than the inept production of people who at least seem to understand what people want, I think we're missing a huge opportunity to bring traditional and classical back into the majority.
I think bad trad suggests a need and an opportunity for a corrective, because those buildings will be built. They can be built, they can be designed well or poorly, but they will be built. And there is the desire, but once you deinstitutionalize that in education, then it goes away. Nobody has access to the tools or the methodology that might produce better buildings. And bad trad is still, in many cases, more principled than bad something else. I mean, there is a certain, in some cases, depends at what end of the spectrum it is.
If I could just add, just as a point of, look, I've seen over the years, and over quite a few years, I've seen so many shopping strips recast over time, and they get slightly more classical with each recasting.
Mm-hmm.
And it's still really awful at the height of that progression, but it is a progression and it needs to be pushed forward.
This is a little painful for me, talk about conflict, but if you've been through Dulles Airport and you go to some of the remote terminals, they have been demodernized in really peculiar ways, where you'll have these models that are repeated throughout the concourse, of doors to the lounges or back of house spaces that are in these vaguely Doric, terrifying embrasures. It's interesting. It's telling, but you wish it were done. You wish it were done well. But I just want to share with you sort of my own experience, right? Because I loved many different kinds of buildings when I was exposed to architecture. And then I was somewhat of an autodidact when I was younger, because that was sort of all the only resources I had were books. But when I went to Cornell, I was never taught to hate anything. And I was always encouraged to do things well. But we started from this very abstract place of basic principles. But those principles, granted, the spatial models were usually modernist, not classical. But they gave me the tools to understand traditional space and elements, and the idea that there is an idea that relates space, proportion, surface, tectonics to one another. So when, as a practitioner, I had certain interests that I wished to pursue, I think I had enough arrows in my quiver so that I could compensate for inadequacies or just lacuna in my education, like things that I wasn't taught. But I think I was given a solid enough foundation that I was able to seek out the resources I needed to work competently in other expressive styles. And I think if that were more prevalent, if there were, no education should be value neutral. It's kind of hard to say, everything is equal. But if there is an awareness through education, as part of the basic education of an architect, not just to fall asleep in a slide lecture about history, but to actually understand what the relationship of culture to construction, to resources, to economies, technology, and to, as a continuum, then there wouldn't be this kind of duality that seems so counterproductive.
Well, you inspire me to think that maybe there's a way of having this institute do a book, that looks at bad trad and shows how it can evolve. I mean, I think the largest problem we're facing right now in America is visual illiteracy.
Yes.
At almost every level, administratively too. So maybe another kind of radical intervention would be, and I've learned so much today, and I'm going tonight to be rewarded in a way for what I've tried to accomplish. But I learned so much just from the two lectures today that I think there's a place in the in the vocabulary here, not vocabulary, but in the pattern of what we do, to have some more education endorsed by this organization and maybe by the group in Washington that's been fighting against the new monument to Eisenhower, that kind of thing, to show people the alternatives. I don't think that they have enough chances to see the choices that can be made. So that when you lose a big commission, or not, you don't even have a chance to make a big commission, that you look at a critique of what was being proposed, and that would be one of the things we do as a kind of radical exercise, where you could redraw something. I saw a book years ago by Brent Brolin, who was at Yale actually, who did look at a lot of modernist designs as infill, and then showed how they can be redrawn to fit in. That was the first thing that opened my eyes. That's probably 20 years ago. But I'm just thinking maybe there's a need to do that now, particularly with contemporary work.
It'd be interesting to see that go both ways. I think if you could sort of equalize the bias that exists in education, it could produce better architects, or at least architects who would respect and appreciate one another's work and be able to build something next to the other.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much.